Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinemancuso, and this is Review Roundup. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the latest and sometimes greatest films coming to a cinema near you. But before we go any further, if you haven't yet, please like this video. It really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people find the channel. And, since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way you never miss reviews like this. This live stream will feature partial spoilers, but we can and will get into full spoilers at the end of each film discussion, so I can kind of read out your questions and your comments. So to that end, leave questions and comments, right? If you're watching this live, first of all, welcome. Second of all, conversations like this are always going to be more interesting when we can have a dialogue. So as I'm kind of going through my own thoughts here, let me know what you think. Unless it's something like super offensive, I will read every comment and question from the live chat. If you're watching this after the fact, still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be some time codes down in the description, so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. And you should definitely subscribe so that you can join us live next time. So coming up, we're going to be talking about Frankenstein, directed by Guillermo del Toro. Dr. Victor Frankenstein, a brilliant but egotistical scientist, brings a creature to life in a monstrous experiment that ultimately leads to the undoing of both the creator and his tragic creation.
My maker told his tale, and I will tell you mine. I remember pieces, memories of different men. And I saw it. Your name. Victor Frankenstein. My creator. I demand a single grace from you. If you are not to award me love, then I will indulge in rage. Now, run.
Okay, so kind of jumping right into it. Mary Shelley's novel, has been adapted countless times. I'm sure someone has counted them all, but I was not going to take the time to do that because I know it would be dozens and dozens of different, even just looking at films, just like so many different films or parodies or reimaginings or this or that. It's not only a fixture of modern pop culture, or at least the Frankenstein's monster is, but the novel itself is also a well-regarded part of 19th century English literature and arguably the progenitor of all science fiction. This is really there at the beginning, kind of developing the language for the genre, right? And since there's just been so many adaptations and reimaginings of the story, then the Herculean task of adapting it, yet again, necessitates some kind of discernment, right? How do you do something new while keeping true to the source material? And this is just my take. I personally feel that stories that, that can stand the test of time and then are passed down from generation to generation, not only can, but should be updated, to translate the source material's essence for a modern audience with its own set of preoccupations and anxieties, you know. And while the narrative here, in this film more or less unfolds in the same manner as Shelley's novel, Del Toro has made some substantive changes to the way that the narrative is framed, and then subsequently how the ideas that emerge from that reframing, right? So I don't want to make this this is not a video essay by any means, but, you know, kind of looking here, you know, there's some key differences, right? Again, if not in terms of plot, but just in terms of kind of like the way things are being approached. So Mary Shelley was intensely interested in social critique and this novel being social critique. But Del Toro, if he's really making any critique at all, it's a lot more structural. You know, I was reading this interview that Variety was doing. I forget who it was with, but the person being interviewed was just talking about the differences between the original novel and this film, and discussed how, you know, this film is a lot more focused on, again, those structural kind of forces like war and militarism and capitalism. I wasn't really getting a lot of that, but nonetheless, if it's making any kind of critique, it's definitely in those spheres rather than making kind of any social critique. You know, Victor's motivations in the original novel, you know, they originally highlighted the hubris of science, right, and the danger of unchecked ambition. But Del Toro's Victor is motivated, by contrast, or at the very least subconsciously motivated, by shame and trauma, going all the way back to his relationship with his mother and father. And I want to put a pin in that. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And you know, if Shelley's story explored parenthood insofar as Victor's abandonment of his creation, Del Toro's version explores, you know, a parent-child relationship really moving towards, you know, catharsis, or rather it's yearning for a catharsis. Again, something completely absent from the book. You know, Victor is pretty morally reprehensible, has no interest in being any kind of father figure or feels any responsibility to the thing that he's created. And, you know, likewise, the creature, because of that, has no reason to really have any sentimentality for Victor. So this whole kind of idea of, you know, parent-child relationship, particularly father-son, that's just not really present in the book. At least in a way where it's like, we're going to explore, like, and use this to explore how such a relationship can achieve catharsis, right? And furthermore, any sympathy in the original book that we felt for the creature was secondary to the horror that Shelley wanted us to experience, right? His existence itself represented the logical conclusion of the scientific pursuits of her day, right? This was something that people were trying to do and was considered an inevitability, right? Rather than an impossibility. And Shelley really wanted the creature to reflect where blind scientific, you know, questioning and pushing the boundaries, like where that goes if there's no guardrails. So again, the monster, I really should call him the creature, right? The creature, it's not really meant, we're meant to have sympathy for him, of course, but nonetheless, he is almost more like a symbol of something or a plot device. By contrast, Del Toro flips that balance, right? So it's, you know, primary is the sympathy, and there's not really that much horror, right? At least horror for the monster, right? Horror that he even exists, horror just at his appearance. We don't really get any of that here. And one of the things that is not super important, but it's definitely notable, is the role of women, right? It's also fundamentally transformed here in ways that make the story both more and less feminist. And if you've seen the film, you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? You know, Shelley's original female characters, the few that there were, right? Again, full disclosure, I haven't read the original novel, but, you know, the primary one being like Elizabeth, played here by Mia Goth. You know, the characters in the original book, the female characters, were passive and existed primarily as plot devices to, you know, spoiler alert for this book that came out over 200 years ago. Elizabeth in the book gets murdered by the monster, essentially out of revenge for, you know, all these heinous things that Victor's done. And in this film, though, Elizabeth is much more of an active participant in her own story. And looking at that character, Elizabeth, she's not only reimagined, but expanded, right? So in the original novel, she was Victor's fiance, but now she's his brother's fiance. Not really sure what the purpose of that change is, other than, being able to have like the dramatic tension of Victor's advances versus her kind of pushing back against it. But I'm not really sure how much it added, even in a vacuum, let alone like kind of shaping the entire, kind of giving shape to what we're meant to take away from the story, right? And while Mia Goth is hit or miss in general, but in this film, her performance is a tad dull. The character on paper, nonetheless, is much more active than her literary counterpart. She's interested in entomology, like the study of insects. And in order to do that, you have to really be delicate with these little bugs. So she brings a natural tenderness, especially in her interactions with the creature, that Victor obviously lacks. Like I mentioned before, she rejects Victor's advances. And while she still, spoiler alert, she still dies in this. But instead of the monster / creature killing her, Victor is trying to kill the creature, and she like gets in the middle of it and gets shot. So she still dies in the service of male arcs, so it's still not great, but at least she is an active participant in her death. Though it should be noted that the creature can't die, so her death is ultimately meaningless. She didn't really save him from anything, because he would have survived the gunshot anyhow, right? And while this is not a completely new idea, Del Toro really hangs his hat on the father-son dynamic, right, between Victor and the creature. His motivations, like we mentioned earlier, his motivations to cheat death or discover or to find the mechanism through which you can cheat death. It goes, again, whereas in the book, from my understanding, like I said, I've not read it, but I've been doing prep before this movie has even come out, kind of being like, okay, I need to make sure I can like speak reasonably enough about like the broad strokes of like what this book is really all about. Not just on a narrative level, but like thematically, conceptually, things like that. From my understanding, in the novel, Victor doesn't have some tragic backstory, and that's why he wants to. It's really because he's just motivated and compelled by the ambition, right? In this motivation is takes root back to his childhood, with his own parents, right? So his mother, who he adores, and his father, who he does not adore and is kind of absent, and he's a surgeon, and he's trying to teach Victor how to, become a surgeon or understand human anatomy. There's this really weird, tense kind of dynamic between the three of them. And ultimately, his mother dies in childbirth. And his abusive father, who, like I said, is a surgeon, and, a doctor. But back then, if you were a surgeon, you were like a jack of all trades. You could do like everything, right? You don't have to be like a labor delivery doctor. It didn't matter. His father's unable to save his mother. And in that sense, Victor, whether explicitly or more likely implicitly, seeks to supersede his father, right? And I think that is something so primordial, or maybe the better word, primal, right? That's something really innate, at least in like male dynamics. But I think you could probably apply this to all human beings, regardless of your gender, your biological sex, or your gender identity, right? But this idea of like wanting to supersede what has come before. But Victor also clearly has mommy issues, and the reason why I'm saying this is Del Toro has made the deliberate creative choice to have Mia Goth not only play Elizabeth, who Victor is enamored with and sexually interested in, but Mia Goth also plays his mother in like these flashbacks. So like the whole thing is very Oedipal, right? Like the idea of killing the father by means of superseding him, being with the mother by means of wanting a woman that is very much physically similar to your mother. Like there's a lot of really weird stuff going on, and not all of it bad, but it just should be noted. This is, from my understanding, this is really not part of the book's conception of any of this, right? And ultimately, he ends up repeating the same mistakes of his father with the creature, right? The son becomes the father. And as his father was cold and cruel, so too is Victor. They do add like this idea, because in the original novel, the minute the creature opens its eyes, Victor's horrified and abandons it and is like, "This is an abomination," blah blah blah. Which really speaks to the novel's version of Victor, who's like so fueled by ambition, but he's like such a pussy to like deal with the consequences of like his ambition. And not even like, he hasn't even found out that the monster's gonna like, go on this violent rage or whatever it is. Like just purely like the minute the shit gets real, he's like, I made a mistake. I'm bouncing, right? Whereas here, Victor tries to kind of be a parent, but then eventually becomes frustrated. And, as a result, the story becomes about intergenerational reconciliation and about breaking cycles. The family cycles that perpetuate trauma and misgiving and tension and isolation, right? Trying to, with the creature in a sense is a opportunity to break the cycle. Because you have to assume that Victor's father's father, so Victor's grandfather, was not super nice to Victor's father, right? It's not like a unique, like, oh, this person was a bad apple. It's like, this is clearly a generational problem, right? And so like this kind of reframing or refocus on that father-son dynamic and the way it plays out is probably the biggest narrative and thematic departure from the original text. Shelley goes in the novel, really goes to great lengths to critique, this scientific ambition with no guardrails, but specifically masculine ambition, right? In spite of any consideration for ethics or just like fundamental goodness, right? Many scholars, if you will, have noted that his scientific hubris is one thing, but specifically with the idea of trying to create life solo, him doing it by himself, it reflects a desire, however implicit, to bypass the need for women, right, in the act of creating life, and the idea, and then later in the story, both in the novel and here, when the creature basically is like, "Look, I can't die. You basically have locked my soul into like this shell, and I can't die. Can you at least make like a companion for me?" Right, so that way I can trudge through this eternal existence with someone, by my side, and Victor's horrified by it in both versions, because to do that, because he pays lip service to this idea that like, if I do that, then you guys could procreate and we'll have like a earth littered with like these little abomination devil people, but I think really if you're looking at it from that lens, about how his ambition is to thwart the necessity of the womb, right? And that maybe that's a more politically correct way to put it, right? This is channel. I'm sorry if you're watching that. We are a pro trans rights channel, right? All that stuff. But nevertheless, a womb is a physical. Whatever gender the person is who has it, a womb is still necessary for conception and creation of human life, right? At least at this stage in our scientific understanding, that's still required. So the fact that Victor wants to try to bypass that, if you look at it through that light, then the creature's request to be given a companion is horrifying, because then in that point, that would bypass him, right? If he were to create a female creature, then he's no longer necessary to the process, right? They could then just kind of procreate on their own. And like I mentioned in the original novel, as soon as the creature comes to life, Victor's instantly horrified by what he's done and immediately abandons it. And there's no desire by either party, right, to achieve any semblance of familial catharsis, right? And I think part of that, since you're really downplaying the scientific ambition part of it, it's a shame that Victor isn't as deranged in his ambition as other adaptations, right? and this isn't just about his character, right? So famously, the book has like this framing device of this captain and crew on a boat sailing to the North Pole, and they get trapped in ice. And it seems like this was not very well conceived. This was not a very well conceived voyage, but the captain is kind of almost blind in his determination to do it. And then they happen upon Victor and the creature, and then they learn their story. And spoiler alert, the whole point is that the captain eventually then is like, we gotta turn back, right? And the point of the framing device is to show the parallel, in terms of like blind ambition versus, not that you should not push the boundaries, because so much of the human experience, but specifically the scientific realm of things, has been defined and advanced by pushing the boundaries. So Frankenstein, neither the novel nor this film are trying to say, don't step out of your comfort zone, don't push beyond what is conceived to be possible, but rather on being willing to understand that, knowing when to quit. In that's really the spirit of science. Is like, if something doesn't work, then you try to figure out why it doesn't work and move on and try something else, or and maybe determine like maybe this shouldn't be done in the first place, right? But this framing device is so unnecessary in this version of the film that really is not super concerned with using Victor to display that masculine hubris, that scientific hubris, right? And yet the film still makes it very clear, even having a character literally say it, that Victor is the real monster, not the creature, right? And at this point, even if that is still like a mind-blowing read on the story, for like a mainstream audience that like thinks the monster's name is Frankenstein, because like they've never actually engaged with the source material, like at a certain point, like he's almost become like a public domain. I mean, it is Frankenstein, the original thing, is a public domain thing, but like almost something that is so natural to our understanding of pop culture. So even for those people, right, who are, if I were to say, Victor Frank, the doctor, he was the real monster, I feel like a lot of people still in 2025 would be like, oh, whoa. Like that was like my experience, like in high school, like on Tumblr, of like, knowledge is knowing Frankenstein isn't the monster. Wisdom is knowing that he is the monster. And like that's really important thematically, but like even if that's kind of novel for a lot of mainstream audiences, like it still feels really obvious and a little self-satisfied to point this out so explicitly, right? And Oscar Isaac, he's turning in a solid performance here. I will say he does feel a bit miscast. Like, I love the guy, and I've never disliked any of his performances, but I don't think I've ever seen anything he's ever been in. And to be fair, I've not watched his entire filmography completely, but I've never seen a performance from him that I'm like, wow. Like, it really, like, takes me aback, right? But, that's like the whole Victor kind of side of things. The creature's tale, right? That's how Del Toro breaks up the story. It starts with Victor's tale and then creature's tale with like a title card. The creature's tale easily exceeds that of Victor, right? And adaptations of this novel have varied in the humanizing, in terms of the humanizing that's done or the sympathy that is intended to be generated. But my understanding is that this film is one of the most sympathetic and humanizing portrayals of the creature, right? The best portion of the film is the time that he spends self-actualizing when he's hiding out in that family's house, right? And of course, iconically, his interactions with the blind old man who sees more than we could ever know, right? That kind of cliche. A lot of ways it kind of starts here, right? Those interactions are very touching. And my biggest exposure to Frankenstein was actually watching Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. So like, for a lot of things, like when I first saw that movie, like I didn't know what certain things were being a parody of. So I know that now, and I knew there was like this whole blind man thing, but like I just think about the Gene Hackman, Peter Boyle interactions, with Peter Boyle as the monster and Gene Hackman as like this blind. I think he's meant to be like a priest or a monk or something. And it's just like comedy ensues, and it's just hilarious, right? But this character, I think in an attempt to humanize him, I think it kind of makes it a little too bland, right? And his characterization is kind of hurt by this thematic reimagining. You know, a major preoccupation for Shelley was the way that people are othered by society, even if they have done nothing to harm them. That it's something in human nature that we instantly make snap judgments about people, especially if we don't fully understand it. Del Toro is clearly disinterested with that angle. You know, the creature, he's just too handsome, right? You know, and that's the thing. You can see this picture here, over here on the left side of the screen. You know, Jacob Elordi, he does, you know, he's a handsome guy. And the only thing that's really grotesque about him is the assembly of the flesh. But especially if he has a bunch of clothes on, he's not that reviling, right? You know, he is still feared and reviled diegetically within the story, but his arc is much more of like a coming of age kind of thing. And you know, Elordi, he does a serviceable job here. But I've heard people whisper like, oh, like maybe I should vote for him for best supporting actor. And I'm like, I don't know. I just don't know. I don't think it's anything against him. I just don't know if he really gets enough to work with for his performance. So that his performance is like, you know, anything particularly revelatory or affecting, you know what I mean? But you know, if you are a major Guillermo del Toro fan, then what he has laid out before you is nothing short of a feast, right? His fascination with the gothic and the bizarre, it's on full display here, and the film's, you know, 2.5 hour runtime gives the film an epic quality to it. That being said, I've never disliked any of his films. Even his best work always falls like just short of greatness for me. Perhaps maybe this is reductive, but his whimsical yet grotesque kind of style just doesn't really work for me. It's not necessarily that the tone of his films is silly or unserious, but there's just like a visual playfulness with his cinematography choices that can occasionally create tension with the story that he's trying to tell. You know, speaking of visuals, despite this ultimately being a Netflix original, the visuals are not nearly as flat as you would expect them to be, which is not a ringing endorsement, but you know, we got to work with what we got here. You know, I was actually fortunate enough to see the film in an actual theater, and at the very least, it didn't just feel like a streaming movie just blown up, you know, 10, 15 feet tall. You know, the practical effects in this movie are really where this film shines. Particularly that initial corpse, it's just like part of the torso and the head and arms, that Victor reanimates during like a demonstration. You know, that was very impressive. And maybe that was just CGI, but it looked really convincing, if it was. That being said, there's plenty of CGI in this movie that is not convincing, and it's used a little bit too liberally here, and it leaves much to be desired in a lot of ways. So now it's time for the Q&A, where I look at the live chat and answer any of your comments or questions. I will read any comment or question that you got here, and I'm looking here at the live chat, and no one's put a question or comment. This is insane. How could you all do this? You know, like I said before, these conversations are always more interesting when we can have a dialogue, because you might say something I didn't think about, or say something that I forgot to kind of include, or think about it in a different way. So I always love to see that you guys are thinking about this too. And also it makes me feel like I'm not, it makes this feel less like an echo chamber. At least it doesn't make it feel, it makes it feel less of like an echo chamber than it already is, right? But if you are watching, have any thoughts, and you're furiously typing, I'm going to move on to the next section, but I will try to read it out if anyone's able to sneak anything in. But, you know, in terms of like my final thoughts on Frankenstein, I think that there's, you know, Guillermo del Toro is a director with a capital D, right? I don't think there's any dispute about that. Like, when you see a del Toro film, you know it by sight. But I just don't, I think the script, while interesting, again, an interesting reframing, you know, you lose a lot of the really interesting social commentary and philosophical ideas here. This is much more focused on the characters, but yet is not really a super character-driven story. And I just think there's a lot kind of I think there's just like a lot of pieces here, and I don't know if I can even say like, oh, it doesn't really work, because again, if you like this and him, I think you're gonna have a phenomenal time with this movie. But for me, I think it just fell a little short. So I think I'm gonna have to give I was gonna give it a 7, but after kind of talking about it, I think I gotta give this a 6. Right? So net positive is okay. But I don't know if I would ever really want to or need to watch this again, especially considering how long it is and that runtime. It's, as the great Roger Ebert once said, no great movie is too long and no bad movie is short enough. So it's not necessarily because it's 2.5 hours, but that what is being done in those 2.5 hours feels a little it can just feel a little tedious at times. All right, so that's Frankenstein. So coming up, we're going to talk about The Running Man, directed by Edgar Wright. Desperate to save his sick daughter, working-class Ben Richards is convinced by The Running Man's charming but ruthless producer to enter the deadly competition game as a last resort. But Ben's defiance, instincts, and grit turn him into an unexpected fan favorite and a threat to the entire system. As ratings skyrocket, so does the danger, and Ben must outwit not just the hunters, but a nation addicted to watching him fall. That's coming up.
I've been thinking about the show. For the next 30 days, everyone in the country is trying to murder me. And that's crazy, right?
People on these games never come back.
We have no choice. We need money for a doctor now.
Welcome to The Running Man. Contestants will be hunted for 30 days. Anyone can kill you.
Hunt them down!
Survive, and you will walk away with $1 billion.
I always thought this was fake.
Oh, shit!
Feeling pretty real now.
I need weapons, an ID, and a disguise. Holy shit, is that C4?
That's not for sale.
Don't you get it? This game is rigged. I got a grenade!
Back at you.
Everything okay, Mr. Springer?
Yeah.
You know why they cheered for you down there?
Go, go!
If you could survive against those goons, so can they.
I'm just trying to get back to my family.
They're here.
I'll be honest with you.
I can't just let you win this game.
What the fuck is happening?
Welcome to The Running Man.
Okay, so kind of just jumping right in here. I don't know if you noticed, I took off my jacket because the heat's on and I'm boiling in here. So, while the film is an incredibly fun action film, and the trailers really made sure to drive that home, it should be noted just how compelling the underlying premise really is, right? There's a reason that so many of Stephen King's novels have been adapted to the screen, right? Because they often feature, these high concept ideas that instantly draw your interest, right? And the commentary that was being laid out by the original 1982 novel and its 1987 film adaptation with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this is, I guess, kind of a remake, but I guess the plot's kind of different enough. The commentary being laid out in the novel and the original film are even more relevant today than they were back in the 1980s. And it's obvious why Wright and co-writer Michael Bacall wanted to bring this story to modern audiences, right? You just think about things like reality television, which was in its infancy during the 1980s. Not only serves as mindless entertainment to placate the restless masses, right, and keep them in line, but the genre itself provides a social, if not literal, bloodlust, right? We love to watch absolute train wrecks of people, ruin their lives in front of millions and millions of people. I don't know why we do, but we just enjoy it, right? And the film's also reflecting on the power of mass media, right, to propagandize those restless masses. In this film and also in our world, there's corporate influence over everything, least of all the government, right, which is already a problem. And that kind of corporate influence it's taken to its most logical extreme here in this movie. But the thing with this movie, but however relevant these ideas are, they're always presented best when done organically. As the film progresses, it becomes clear that Edgar Wright he's really trying to explicitly explore an oppressed populace and the nature of resistance and revolution. But the dialogue that characters expound on these topics is overwritten. It's often overwritten, at least, and can be trite. This film, it's not doing this film any favors that it's, it becomes painfully obvious the film's shortcomings in that arena when you consider fantastic works of resistance media, like This Fall's One Battle After Another, or even something like Disney's Andor series set in the Star Wars universe. When Disney, even though it's like the famously, like, that show had a lot of creative freedom to kind of do what it wanted, Tony Gilroy could kind of do what he wanted, but when Disney is outflanking you on interesting revolutionary storylines, that might be a problem, right? But to use an appropriate analogy, if the film is The Running Man, then it really stumbles like just before the finish line, with a narrative conclusion so sloppy that it seriously takes the film down a peg. There's this ambiguity, spoiler alert, there's this ambiguity about, if Ben survives this climactic plane crash at the end. But then we get this question immediately answered. And maybe perhaps this is just an issue with the original novel, right? As Stephen King, while he's visionary and singular, he's just inconsistent in terms of quality. And maybe he just didn't know how to end this story, right? But because this film is based on a novel that is presumably chapter-based, the film also felt a little too episodic, which hurt the pacing. And of course, there was always something exciting happening, but it felt a tad too long, especially as we moved into the third act. But all of these problems are helped somewhat, asterisk, right, somewhat, by our likable hero Ben Richards, right? It helps that Glenn Powell is a bona fide movie star. Apparently this film isn't doing great at the box office, but at least in terms of the visual and the kind of personality that Powell has, he seems to have taken up the mantle that Tom Cruise created. Glenn Powell, of course, is close with Tom Cruise. Glenn Powell was in the new Top Gun Maverick movie from a couple years ago. And he's kind of taken up this mantle that Cruise created of the handsome, charming leading man thrust into these kind of ridiculous action films and ridiculous action sequences, right? And he is no doubt handsome and charming. There is some partial nudity in this movie, and I am a red-blooded heterosexual man, but I can at least appreciate good form, right? You know what I mean? But Glenn Powell's likability might actually hurt the film because Ben, the character, is almost too likable, right? His motivations are purely selfless, even if they are limited to his own clan, right? His wife and his daughter, the latter of which is sick, and he's kind of closed off from considering what he's doing almost being like a symbol of revolution and defiance. But that being said, the initial motivations are still selfless, right? He's not doing it for the money, for himself, or this, right? And he doesn't really have any flaws to overcome, right? No lessons to learn. Like I mentioned, there is this arc about learning that these problems are bigger than him and he has to think big picture. But we've already seen that from him and how how we're told a lot of tell not show. We're told how he sticks his neck out for his fellow workers, and he's been fired from jobs because he, you know, demands better conditions for his fellow coworkers, or things, because he's like a blue collar guy, and and unions is a big part of it. So it doesn't really seem like he needs to learn this lesson about like people other than his immediate family matter. Like it seems like he already believes that and has lived his life that way. So it would have been better. Again, apparently in the original novel, the character was rather detestable, like racist and sexist. But surely there could have been some kind of happy medium, or not even medium, because you don't want to be in the middle between likable and racist. But like there had to be some kind of other option where he could still be likable or sympathetic, but still like has he's not perfect, right? And there's opportunities for him to grow, because ultimately that's like the bedrock of narrative, right? That's why we keep coming back not only to stories in general, but the same stories, because there's something cathartic. Aristotle, we're really going back now. Aristotle talked about this, right? The whole point of drama is so that the audience can achieve catharsis vicariously without having to go through all the tumult that the characters go through, right? The audience is still able to achieve that catharsis regardless. But at the end of the day, the film is, at its best when we get to see Ben being creative. And by contrast, it's at its worst when he's relegated to the backseat, right? When things are just happening to him rather than, him actually making decisions that's changing the course of the events that we're witnessing. And the rest of the cast is filled out by big names, and even if you don't necessarily know everyone by name, there's a lot of people that you're gonna recognize, right? Michael Cera in this is funny as like the underground kind of nerdy resistance fighter who's like printing, photocopying zines, right? Though he is a bit miscast here, I think. You got Josh Brolin here playing the producer of the Running Man show, and while he's always great in everything that he's in, he doesn't really get much to do. And the big sore spot I think in the cast is Jamie Lawson, right, who plays Ben's wife. It's really disappointing to see, if I could be completely blunt, it's really disappointing to see her turn in what I would classify as a mediocre performance, right? I've never been a huge fan of her work. Like, I felt like she was the weakest link in both Sinners and The Batman. But some of her issues to be fair, some of her issues could have been with the dialogue, which in general can be a bit too straightforward and expository. And she's not in the film that much, but it seems like a majority of her dialogue would fit that description, right? The entire film has this kind of dialogue problem, but it seems like most of the things she says, is the reason why I would say the film on the whole has it. Like, obviously other people have it as well, but, so I'm not gonna put all of this on Jamie Lawson, but I do gotta say I've never, I don't dislike her work, but I've just never been like blown away by anything that she's done. The standout here, despite Powell's charm, right? So it's hard to outshine Glenn Powell here. The standout here is easily Coleman Domingo as Bobby T, the host of the show, of The Running Man. His character, it's always interesting when you see like these dystopian oppressive societies, because his character feels like oil in a jar of water, right? Like he kind of exists on top of it or independent of it, right? The rules of this world don't quite apply to him, or at least they don't apply in the same way. And the way that he wields the emotions of the crowd, often for propagandizing purposes, right? Where it's, like these awful guys are hunting Glenn Powell, then he sets off an explosion that kills some of them. They do like the 5 brave men and women have died, and they have like the kids holding the candles, right? Like he's able to wield the emotion of the crowd, and it really captures like the carnivalistic nature of this society and its bloodlust. And there's I'm sure a lot has been written. So maybe I should really say there's more for me to read about like how like what is the idea, like what is the how do I put this, like what is the contributing factor that leads to bloodlust, but specifically like social bloodlust, right? Oh, I just hit my mic. Like not just an individual, but like a group of people going to, the classic example, going to the Colosseum in Rome and watching, the people get torn limb from limb by the lions. Like, why is that a historic historically recurring thing. And I'm not sure, but you know, and I think we're seeing that a lot with our world, again, even if it's just reality TV or politics of resentment or retribution, that those who can wield the crowd wield immense power, right? But in spite of itself, you know, despite all these problems with the film, you know, the film it's still wildly entertaining and definitely a fun watch. I definitely would recommend seeing it. Maybe not in theaters, like unless you have the income, you can you know, you're not super precious with you have enough expendable income that doesn't really matter going to see a movie, but I think nonetheless you should, before you die, I think it would be worth seeing, right? You know, and Edgar Wright is undoubtedly an inventive filmmaker, and that's on full display here. But like I've never been a huge fan of his. His films always lack that extra little sauce for me. But you know, that being said, I've only seen what have I seen? Shaun of the Dead, Scott Pilgrim, Baby Driver, which is probably my favorite of the bunch, and now this, right? And these films, they're always entertaining, but with the exception of like maybe Baby Driver, you know, they're never particularly affecting, right? But even if, you know, when I was talking about Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, one of the things I said is, you know, if you love his work, you're gonna love this movie because it's everything about him on full display. I have a feeling that big Edgar Wright stans are probably the biggest detractors of this movie, and that there's probably a sense both for his fans as well as just the industry in general that his best work is perhaps behind him. All right, so now it's the part of the show where I read your questions and comments here. Look at the live chat. I think I see Viviana put something down. I think the main flaw is his anger, but throughout it comes off as justified based off of his experience with the system. That's such a great point, Vivian, because again, it's sometimes with films there is like a on paper kind of theme or idea, and but then there's like the actual execution. I don't know why I'm like stumbling on my words. The execution of it, right? And I think they were inserting all these things to show like that's his flaws, that like he gets too angry, so like that's why he gets fired, because like he sticks his neck out for people and kind of blows off like flies off the handle. But again, I don't know if that's like, okay, on paper that makes sense, but I feel like all the times he's been angry, both when we're told about him being angry in the past and when we see him get angry, it's all justified. This is like the worst possible society that you could live in. So I completely agree that it just feels completely justified based off of like the system, right? And the way that this society is set up. You know, there's this great kind of moment later in the film when he, you know, carjacks the car with the woman in it, and she's more affluent, and he's like, you know, like, look at your scarf. Like, that scarf could have, like, bought us food for 6 months or something, right? And to you, it was just a scarf. It's just something kind of, like, cute or, you know, kind of floofy to put on, right? Like, it is a deeply unequal society. Again, something that was front of mind in the 1980s, but has unfortunately only gotten more and more relevant as time has gone on. Now, you know, we're looking about 40 some odd years, you know, 40 years later, right? Okay, so final thoughts here on The Running Man. I thought that there was a lot to like here. I thought it was entertaining. Its flaws are you know, I think they're solvable problems, right? You know, the dialogue being too kind of on the nose and pleased with itself about like the people are more powerful than they realize, like things like that. But it's solvable, right? You could do another draft. You could fine tune the dialogue. I think the biggest fundamental problem is just the way it ends, right? You know, and again, I can't speak to how it ends. From my understanding, this movie, this version is much closer to the novel than the Arnold Schwarzenegger version was from the 1987. But I just think that you know, you might have to kill your darlings there and then just go off on some completely different kind of ending, and really make the story your own, you know. But you know, there was a lot of fun here, a lot of interesting ideas nonetheless, and I'm always down to see a dystopia. It feels cathartic to watch because it feels like we're not too far off from getting somewhere like that. So, you know, not a perfect movie by any means, but wildly entertaining, certainly watchable. I'm gonna give this a 7 out of 10, which you know, when I was thinking about this, between this and Frankenstein, I was thinking Frankenstein. I like Frankenstein more, but after having now talked about it, I think, you know, The Running Man, I think, is a 7. It's good. It's definitely flawed, but you know, it could, like, had it had maybe some more time in the oven, it could have been something a lot stronger. And what am I doing here? There we go. All right, so that's it for this installment of Review Roundup. You know, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And, you know, since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way,